Okay, this is lesson 8.1, expanding the U.S. influence. The objective for today is that you will be able to explain the changing policies of the United States towards Latin America and Asia and the growing influence of the United States in foreign markets. And we're going to talk about the Spanish-American War, the impact that had, President Roosevelt, and how he finally expanded our trade and became a global influence. So first, the Spanish-American War. What was it and how did we get involved? Well, it took place actually in Cuba. And the reason why it took place was in 1898, Cuba wanted their independence from Spain. They felt like Spain was a harsh ruler, there was a lot of unfair treatment, and so Cuba wanted their independence. And so they turned to the United States for help in overthrowing the Spanish government. So the U.S. President McKinley intervened by sending the USS Maine battleship to Cuba in order to help with the uprising against the Spanish government. However, while the USS Maine was stationed there, there was an explosion, killing 250 soldiers on board. Now, at the time, we weren't really sure what the explosion was, or it wasn't public knowledge. It's later believed that there was a fire on board, and that's what happened and why there was an explosion. But this explosion essentially led to the U.S. declaring war on Spain, and it was known as a splendid little war. Cuba did eventually get their independence. As you know, it's no longer controlled by Spain. This political cartoon right here does a great job of explaining kind of what Cuba was getting itself into. Here is a Cuban woman with a Cuban flag trying to essentially hop out of the frying pan and into the fire. So the idea of leaving Spain because Spain was mistreating them, but yet hopping into the fire of anarchy and continuously being mistreated again by even the United States. So what impact did this have? Well, this really kind of was one of the starting points for imperialism throughout parts of Latin America and Asia, and led to the United States being a colonial power. The United States became extremely imperialistic, and they implied their imperialistic powers on Hawaii, which at this point in time was an independent nation, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippine Islands, and eventually took over many of these areas and still has today. Hawaii is a state and Puerto Rico is a United States territory. Imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. So diplomacy would be like controlling a government, and then military force, obviously sending in the military. You have your political cartoon here. We see Uncle Sam at a restaurant. Well, I hardly know which to take first. And we have Cuba, we have Puerto Rico, we have the Philippines, the Sandwich Islands. So, you know, just kind of this idea of like Uncle Sam, what do I want to take over? What do I want to control? And part of this ability to do this was because of the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine stated that Europe could not get involved in any affairs in the Americas. So that allowed the United States purely to have control over places like Latin and South America. Which leads us to our 26th president, President Roosevelt. And President Roosevelt continued this idea of imperialism in Panama. Panama at the time was not independent. It was a part of Colombia. And President Roosevelt encouraged Panama to rebel against Colombia and fight for its independence, which it did. And so therefore, as a result, Panama then allowed Roosevelt to build the Panama Canal. So before the Panama Canal was built, if you wanted to ship something from the east coast of the United States to the west coast of the United States, you used to have to travel all the way around the southern tip of South America. By building the Panama Canal, now ships could cut through, therefore cutting the delivery time in half, and also allowing the United States to really become more of a superpower in trade and shipping, especially because we controlled the Panama Canal. In addition to the Panama Canal, Roosevelt also strengthened the Navy. He really saw a need for ships at this point in time in shipbuilding. He started to make important alliances with Great Britain, which will be important as we get into World War I, because they had one of the strongest navies in the world at the time, and just kind of increasing that fleet and that world power status. Also knowing that by increasing our navy, it also increased the ability to protect ships as they were trading. He also created, or he did not, but his administration created the open door policy, which opened up China to U.S. trade. China, before this, was closed to U.S. trading. It did open this up. However, it did require foreigners to obey Chinese laws while they were there. So just to kind of be sensitive of the Chinese culture and Chinese law. Because of all of these policies, we really started to see the United States expand in their trade and really become a world dominance as far as a superpower is concerned. And part of that was because of President Taft, who became president after Teddy, but followed along in his footsteps of imperialism, was Taft's what we call dollar diplomacy. And what dollar diplomacy did was it protected U.S. business interests in Latin America. So here you can see we have the business interests of the U.S. Steel, oil, AT&T, and these investments would go into Latin America with the protection of the United States and invest there and really take advantage of these other countries and ability to have the United States protect them as they not only controlled their governments essentially, but controlled a lot of their finances because they were U.S.-run companies. So because of all of these things, the important thing that I want you to know is this was really what set us up to be a world player. This is what set us up to be an economic superpower. This is what allowed us to have the power that we needed to intervene in World War I and World War II and have countries really listen to what we have to say and take us seriously because we're such an economic power because of this expansion of trade.